In this lecture, we're going to look at the legacy of Dada in American art of the 20s and 30s. And what we'll find is that in certain avenues, in certain areas, the legacy of Dada was in fact extraordinarily strong. Remember that Dada had an outpost in New York, which included both Duchamp and Picabia. And their kind of engineering-influenced, detailed style of painting, interest in machines rendered almost as if they were illustrations from a owner's manual or a catalog. This led to a movement in the 20s and 30s that we've come to call precisionism. And what this movement is an extraordinarily precise rendering of the built environment. Very few brushstrokes to be seen, a great attention to details of industry. The railroad tracks, the electrical wires next to it, the rivets in the cross tie, all rendered with extraordinary precision. And this is why indeed we call it precisionism. And Charles Sheeler is one of two major proponents of this, although there were quite a few more. And this is really very much a direct outgrowth of the Dada movement. Now, Sheeler had begun as an advertising photographer in the 1910s, and this may well have had something to do with his precisionist tendencies. But commercial photography, also working as an advertising photographer, also brought Sheeler into contact with Alfred Stieglitz, the great photographer in New York City. And his connection with Stieglitz brought to him two very important lessons that came into play as he develops precisionism. The first is, of course, that Stieglitz, as he had done with others, encouraged Sheeler to move into art photography, to sort of bring an artistic side to his commercial photography and think about the camera as more than just a tool of industry, of advertising, and think of the camera as an artistic form. And this seems to have had a huge influence on Sheeler's own photographs. Here we see a photograph from 1927. He was hired by an ad agency to photograph the Ford Motor Plant in Dearborn, Michigan, outside of Detroit. And Sheeler continues to make photographs for advertising agencies to support his artistic career. But he brings an amazing aesthetic sensibility to these photographs. The crisscrossed conveyor belts, rendered almost as if it was a constructivist composition. And I think this is really very much from the influence of Stieglitz, who said, bring an artistic eye to your works. And he certainly does that, and it doesn't seem to have hindered his popularity as a commercial photographer at all. The other great lesson from Alfred Stieglitz is that he actually introduced Sheeler to Dada art, particularly the works by Picabia. Remember, it was Stieglitz who had hosted the very first Picabia show in America. And when Sheeler's photographs brought him into contact with Stieglitz, he not only talked to him about art, photography as art, but also talked to him about other modern art that might influence him, that might help him develop his career. And Picabia's works came to Sheeler via the intervention of Alfred Stieglitz. So again, we see what a major figure this photographer was for the development of art in America. Well, these commercial photos that he's been taking of the Ford Motor Factory in Dearborn, Michigan, became the basis for many precisionist paintings. Here's one from the Whitney. This is exactly the same scene, but viewed from an angle. So it's almost as if we're standing at the right edge of the frame in the National Gallery picture and looking across the canvas. We can see the same smokestack, the same silos there, and the railroad tracks that we see in our picture run immediately adjacent to this pool of water on the right. This is a cement factory that was using some of the remnants of what was used for the automobile factory to actually manufacture cement. Even though this is a plant, and a lot of people were very much interested in the Ford Motor Company because of its mechanization of the production line, and how it really revolutionized industry in America. You'll notice that Sheeler's not interested in human activity at all. It's not about people. His images, right, the workers in the factory, they're certainly not the theme of this. And instead, it's really entirely about the buildings. The buildings are his focus. Now, the smokestack that's belching smoke in the National Gallery picture may well suggest the presence of people, but at the same time, it's really rendered almost as if it's part of the building, part of the landscape itself. I like to kind of read it as the building has a life of its own, and it's breathing, and it's it's exhaling into the environment around it. Because when we look at Sheeler's works, this even though they're so precisely rendered, he's really very much interested in these buildings having a sort of presence, almost an anamorphic presence in the landscapes. Here's another precisionist landscape, a slightly earlier one over in the Phillips collection. You'll notice that he's very much interested in sort of abstract design qualities, uh, whether it's the sharp diagonal that's created by the train tracks against the rigid horizontals and verticals in the classic landscape, or the way in which the skyscrapers in the Phillips picture end up looking almost like a synthetic cubist collage, where the building facades themselves become a series of overlays of flat forms. Sheeler had been to Paris around 1910, and I think that, while we talk about what influenced precisionism, certainly Dada is the major influence, but we can't deny the fact that synthetic cubism is right there as well as an influence on this American modern movement. Um, but again, and here we see with the skyscrapers that people aren't there. The buildings bear the meaning. The buildings are what the picture is all about. And when Sheeler calls this a classic landscape, he suggests that he's looking at this and he's seeing something important. And I think that this is certainly true. In fact, we read the writings by Sheeler, and he said that factories were America's cathedrals. He said that factories provided us, and this is his exact words, our substitute for a religious experience. So he's really looking at these buildings as bearers of very profound meaning, in particular about American identity, and trying to make them something profound. And I think calling it classic landscape only adds to that meaning. Now, these same motifs of overlooked American architecture, silos and factories and whatnot, these had actually enthralled Europeans. Europeans were in love with American architecture, skyscrapers and grain silos. And Le Corbusier is one of the most important European architects, working in the aftermath of the Bauhaus. And he wrote a treatise in 1924 called Toward a New Architecture. It's in French, Vers une architecture, Toward an Architecture in French. And he loved grain silos. He wrote a chapter in this called Eyes That Do Not See, which was all about looking at forms around you, designed forms, and seeing art where it hadn't been recognized. And on a trip to America, he just became enthralled with these. And he sort of puts them in as images of perfect architecture. It's a very functional architecture, and gives us these bold forms that have a great sort of presence and power. And I think Sheeler's picking up on exactly that same thing. Now, we haven't really talked about Corbusier, even though he's, in most people's opinions, one of the most important architects of the 20th century. But we did look at one of his works. He was born Charles-Édouard Jeanneret, and he was one of the purist artists that we looked at. Le Corbusier was his name that he used as an architect. And so we saw this still life when we looked at purism as one of the offshoots of cubism. And we can certainly see that the very precise rendering of these forms, these sort of quasi-architectural forms, also certainly has an influence on precisionism. So we've sort of traced now at least three different movements that have some impact here. Charles Demuth is another precisionist artist working around the Stieglitz group. Although he lives outside of New York, he spends his career in western Pennsylvania, Lancaster to be precise, and because he's part of the sort of the Stieglitz circle, that most artists are involved with New York because it's the place to show your works. He's encouraged also to go to Paris, and he too, like Sheeler, goes to Paris around 1910 or so. And I think you can see in this very precise rendering, again, precisionism of architectural forms without any humans in them whatsoever, that he's channeling certain ideas from Cubism that influences work alongside, of course, the more important New York Dada works of people like Picabia. His most famous work in the Metropolitan Museum in New York is even more strongly Cubist, I think, on a certain level. Stenciled or apparently stenciled numbers over the top of this series of quasi-transparent overlays, totally based on Cubism. Both of these works are on paper, using water-based paints on paper, gouache in particular. This is the medium of commercial advertising artists, and this was another huge influence on Precisionism, were the kind of illustrations that were being done for catalogs and advertising. And here Demuth uses commercial advertising medium, gouache on paper, as a way of sort of showing that debt and using what had been used for commerce, now using it, of course, for higher art. But in addition to that, there are parts of it that are in gold leaf. So the second number 5, the second largest one, is indeed in gold leaf laid on the paper, real gold. And that almost makes the image sacred in a way. It makes it almost like a leaf from a medieval prayer book, a medieval manuscript, with that gilded number 5 in the middle, the number 5 in gold from the title. Now, what does this refer to? This is one of a series of abstract portraits, 8 of them actually, that Demuth had done of modern American artists. He sort of began the series in 1924. He's done by the end of the 20s with these 8 abstract portraits. All of them were friends with Demuth. Not all of them were visual artists, however. And certainly with this idea of doing an abstract portrait, a portrait of somebody that doesn't look like them, he's again channeling the influence of New York Dada. Remember that Picabia had done this abstract portrait of Stieglitz and had done abstract portraits of others in the 1910s. Demuth is picking up on this idea and doing his own series of abstract portraits. In this case, it's a portrait of a poet. And the poet's name was William Carlos Williams, and he based the image on one of Williams's best-known poems called The Great Figure from 1920. And here I've given you the entirety of a poem. It's a rather short poem. Among the rain and lights, I saw the figure 5 in gold. There's the title of the picture. On a red fire truck, moving tense, unheeded, to gong clangs, siren howls, and wheels rumbling through the dark city. This is his tribute to that, his visual interpretation of the words of this poem. And we see, of course, the red of the fire truck, the number 5 moving, decreasing or increasing in size. I'm not 100% sure I know, right? If the train's coming at us or blaring away. Across the bottom, bisecting the largest number 5, we see what appear to be siren horns with lines coming off from them as if they're blaring. We see street lamps above, almost as if we're maybe moving with it, and then buildings behind on either side sort of pushed off. It's almost like a futurist work. It's almost like a cubist work. But again, the precision of rendering. It's not stenciled. It's just drawn with extraordinarily hard-edged, fine precision with that number 5 repeating 3 times in totality, but you can see there's even the edges of a 4th one around the corners of the work. So this is again very much precisionist in mindset. You'll also notice that he's included not only the word Bill up at top. He was friends with Williams, knew him as Bill, but you see part of Carlos uh, underneath the crossbar of the biggest five. And then at the bottom of that five, WCW, William Carlos Williams, rendered in exactly the same size and script as Charles DeMuth's own signature in the lower left corner. Right, so all of these things are meant to evoke not only Williams but his most famous poem, and rendered in this extraordinarily precise style. Another artist working in a very, very detailed and precise style is Grant Wood. And he's not exactly a precisionist, even though in detail. This is extraordinarily detailed in its rendering. The wrinkles on his head, the light on his glasses catching the rims of his glasses, the light falling on his eye and through the lens onto the cornea behind the buttons on his shirt, looking almost as if you could reach out and grab them. It's very precisely rendered, but we don't tend to refer to Grant Wood as a precisionist. And part of that is because it's very traditional. It doesn't have any of the kind of daring inspired by European modern compositions that we saw in Schiller or Demuth. It's rather much more traditional in its approach. And not only that, but traditional in its thematic subject matter. It's a scene of rural, everyday life. And we refer to this work and works like it, these scenes of rural life, often rendered with fidelity to objective reality. We refer to them as regionalism because they're images, of course, of regional life in America. The subject matter usually, but not always, rural. Artists usually based outside of New York City. Grant Wood spends his career in Ames, Iowa, quite a ways away from any major metropolitan region. His work is inspired not by European modernism, but by Northern Renaissance art. He had gone on 3 trips to Europe in the 1920s, and unlike the folks that were closely allied with Stieglitz, he goes and he looks at old masters. He's not interested in modern European art, it seems. He's much more interested in these kinds of works that are harder to see in America yet at this point. These amazing works of the old masters. And he uses these more traditional styles to make an art that he sees as being uniquely American, trying to make a very American kind of picture. And realism is a strong part of that. In fact, a strong sense of realism had long been a characteristic of American art. Here's very early American art, shortly after the Revolution. Rembrandt Peale, one of the first family of American artists. Portrait of his brother Rubens. Their father, Charles Wilson Peale, named all of his sons and daughters after famous artists. There's a Titian Peale as well, Raphael Peale. And here's Rembrandt Peale painting his younger brother Rubens, who was a scientist, who was a horticulturalist, with a potted geranium that he himself had transplanted from the old world. But again, the sort of extraordinary realism that we see here was seen by artists throughout the 19th century and into the early 20th century as being a particularly American trait. And so what we have with Grant Wood and regionalism is something of a backlash, if you will, to Dada, to this influx of European modernism, that they're going to strive out and find a particularly American idiom. And realism was seen as that. Why? Well, because it's true to nature, it's honest. And American artists talked about the fact that a realistic art, unlike Impressionism, post-Impressionist symbolism, that realism is as American as the values that we hold most dear, the values of honesty and a down-to-earth quality. Realism brings us that, and Grant Wood is sort of bringing this 19th century mindset into the 20th century. The regionalists often do this. Now, he said that this painting was based on traveling around the rural Midwest, and he had seen a prairie farmhouse in what's called the Carpenter Gothic style. And he looked at the elongated windows of this house. He didn't see the people there, but he imagined that the people who lived inside of it must have elongated faces, just like the elongated windows of the house. And certainly that's what he renders, is this very, very elongated figure. This is his sister and his dentist. He posed them back in the studio for the people that he imagined lived here. And it sounds kind of satiric. It sounds as if he's mocking these people, but he isn't, even though Grant Wood has an extraordinary sense of humor. There was a big Grant Wood show here at the Renwick a number of years back, almost a decade ago. But I remember going, not thinking I was going to see very much, and I was struck by really how funny his works are. And yet with this one, he's actually quite reverential. He's actually doesn't mean this to be satire at all. He wanted it to be a positive statement of Midwestern values. And the date on it is important for understanding that, because 1930 is the second year of the Great Depression, right? It started with the stock market crash in 1929. And so we're right in the throes of the Great Depression. And what Grant Wood wants this image to show is this hyper-realistic image, to show the honest and steadfast nature of the Midwestern farmer. These are people who will survive, and will, make America, or continue America's greatness, despite the economic trauma that has hit most of the nation. So it's meant to be a very, very hopeful image of American steadfast values. Edward Hopper can almost be viewed as another regionalist artist. Here he's in Cape Cod, where he keeps a house, painting a country, a rural subject matter, husband and wife with their dogs. Not much is happening here. The man is trying to attract the dog to come over. Dog's got other things in mind. He's seen something, a bird, a deer, a squirrel, isn't coming to him. But it's a sort of just a mundane image of rural country life, and in a realistic manner. This too ties it directly into this regionalist movement. Hopper's works are sort of more interesting than that, though, because he has a way of making the figures seem as if they're utterly isolated from each other. He's balled up his sleeves, and we can see where the tan line ends on his arm as he tries to attract the dog, but the dog's not paying any attention to him, despite his best efforts. And that sort of sets this theme for alienation or isolation. And you'll notice that the wife is standing there with him, but there's no communication between them. She's not even looking at him. He's not looking at her. Their expressions are either glum or expressionless. And then you'll notice that he uses the architecture to sort of isolate the figures. You just get all of these strong verticals running through the composition that sort of lock each of the figures into space, into their own space, and sort of add to that sense that while they're here together, they aren't together. They're not in tune with each other. And that's a theme that Hopper works on in nearly all of his paintings, on that sense of alienation and isolation. Here, a rural or urban scene rather than a rural scene, and in fact many of his best-known works are indeed urban scenes. But again, a sense of alienation and isolation. A woman in what soon to be either her apartment or perhaps a hotel room, getting dressed in the morning, taking a moment to sit down and just stare out the window. The lack of clothing suggests a level of intimacy between the viewer and the subject, but again, no connection whatsoever. In fact, all we see is just her nose. Her hair masks most of her face. Her arms mask her private parts. And she stares at something outside the window that we don't even know what it is. Particularly American subjects, right? And these urban subjects. Hopper, by turning to rural subjects, we'll come back to the idea of the isolated figure in just a second, but Hopper working on these urban subjects as well as the rural subjects should bring to mind the Ashcan school, and that certainly also has a huge influence on regionalism as well. our ashcan artists at the beginning of the 20th century had in fact focused on unflinchingly on American urban scenes, and Hopper does very much the same thing. So if we think about what influences regionalism, certainly European Old Master art is one thing, and we'll talk about that next, but also earlier American traditions that are less avant-garde. The Ashcan school as a sort of a 20th century continuation of 19th century traditions. Hopper pulls it all the way into the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. This group of painters would have also been very important to Hopper individually because Hopper had begun his career as a commercial illustrator, and so too had the artists of the Ashcan school. So they were for him, I think, a great role model of how to proceed from advertising employment into fine art. At the same time, that idea of moving from commercial art to fine art is what we saw with Precisionism as well. A number of artists who augment their career by doing illustrations, and then eventually turn to fine art altogether. Now, Hopper had been to Europe in the early 20th century, in the first decade of the 1900s, and like Grant Wood, when he's there, he's much more interested in old masters than he is in modern art. He's interested in the realism of these works. And Vermeer seems to have been a very, very strong influence on Hopper. I like this comparison of these two works side by side, because both of them focus on an isolated woman wrapped up in her thoughts, and that's typical for Vermeer's work. I kind of think of Hopper as kind of a modern Vermeer in some ways. And even though the point of view for you, the viewer, is inside the room with them, there's no indication that they know you're here. It's almost as if you're an interloper, that you don't belong, that you're a voyeur, that you're peeping Tom, looking in. And I think, with Hopper, with Vermeer, that's there. She's in an intimate moment. She's reading what's probably a love letter from a far off paramour, and we're there looking at her in this moment of privacy. And Hopper takes that in the 20th century, of course, amplifies that sense by showing her naked. Vermeer's woman is naked in a different way, psychologically naked, if you will. But for Hopper, that becomes a more physical issue. And that adds to the sense of voyeurism. We shouldn't be here. We shouldn't be looking at her. And we shouldn't be watching. And maybe she shouldn't either. What's she watching out that window? The high rises around, we see the corner coins of the building she's in, but then past that we see windows from another building, and she's not looking far enough down for it to be the street that she's looking at. She's looking probably into someone else's window, in the same way that we're watching her. So there's this theme of voyeurism that seems to run very strong in Hopper, that he picks up and modernizes from Vermeer. The other thing I'd like to look at with the Vermeer comparison is how the other objects in the room play such a huge role in isolating the figure. Vermeer gives us this map on the background, the chairs, everything just locks that figure into place, so that the figure in the center really has absolutely nowhere to go. And we can look at the Hopper picture and sort of see the same sort of thing. We just get all of these objects in here that say, you've got nowhere to go. Notice that there's a chair in the foreground, almost the same place, and then there's this armoire behind, and all of these verticals that end up just locking her into that one place in the composition, such that it appears as if almost that she's got nowhere else to turn, nowhere else to go. And that adds to the loneliness that we see, this sort of frozen quality that, for me, makes the Hopper paintings really wonderful to look at. Hopper's most famous painting is in Chicago, at the Art Institute of Chicago. Nighthawks, or sometimes called Nighthawks at the Diner. Again, I think the theme here is the themes we've been talking about: alienation and loneliness. And you might say, well, it's just a scene of a city, but in fact, this is entirely constructed. These rooms and these streets that we see here are indeed made up by Hopper. They're not any given identifiable location. But they're like stage sets, movie sets, where he can construct these themes. And I think, especially with Nighthawks, he's been looking at film noir. He's been looking at detective movies, from the 1940s and the late 1930s to construct these urban environments. But the buildings in the background of Nighthawks on the opposite side of the street reappear in other pictures as well, or at least the same basic construction. Again, these are all very lonely pictures. Early Sunday morning is depopulated street, a sign of businesses that might welcome people, but no one is here. There's that strange shadow that's cast down the sidewalk from something we can't see, the shadow that runs between the barber pole and the fire hydrant. What is casting that shadow? How tall is that thing? But there's nothing there. There is no there. But the important thing here is that we can see the degree to which the composition of Nighthawks is not based on any kind of photograph he had taken or any particular location, but is a stage that he's created for these human figures to try to tell this story of alienation. And it focuses on these four people inside the diner. And we have presumably a couple, a man with a cigarette, woman looking at what, a mirror, a compact or something. But again, you'll notice that they're not paying any attention to each other. Their hands are close to one another. Maybe there's some flirtation going on there. Maybe they've come in together. But his arm that he rests downward is so strongly vertical, right, that it forms almost a boundary. And then even though they're not looking at each other, the soda jerk, the man behind the counter, is looking toward them. But again, you get these vertical breaks between them. And add to that the sort of physical break across that suggests that, again, despite the fact that there's an attempt at contact, there really is none. These people are as isolated from each other. They're like the salt and pepper shakers on the counter. They may be near each other, but there's no intimacy between them. And then Hopper drives this point home by giving us this third patron who, what's he doing? Is he reading a newspaper? He's got something in his hand. Is it just a glass of, well, it probably is a glass of drink, and he's got a coffee there as well, and that salt shaker. He's finished his dinner, the plate's off his left shoulder, but he's, again, totally isolated from the other two. He's isolated from us as well. His back to us, right? We have no idea what's going on with him. And then where are we? What's our point of view? Unlike that 11 a.m. picture, we're not inside the room with them. We're isolated even more. They've become like specimens under glass that we're looking at dispassionately from outside. All of this adds to this sense of urban isolation and alienation that's traditional, or I should say characteristic of Hopper's work. Our last regionalist artist is also very much interested in rural scenes, but his figures are significantly more expressive and gestural. They don't have that frozen quality of Hopper's work. This is Thomas Hart Benton. Like most American artists, he makes the trip to Europe. That seems to be something that artists just have to do in order to really learn about art. We're more lucky these days. A lot of European artists come to us. I advocate strongly for traveling, but it was much more necessary in the early 20th century to go abroad to see these things, because not as many of them were on view in American museums to the degree that they are today. Like our other regionalist artists, on going to Europe, he's not as much interested in modern art. At least not eventually. He becomes interested in El Greco in particular. And here's a nice El Greco from the National Gallery. Again, interested in the old masters. And from El Greco, he gets these elongated, distorted, expressive figures that you see populating throughout this massive mural of Achelos and Hercules. Now, like our other regionalists, he's also Midwesterner. He's located in the Midwest. He's originally from Missouri, and he settles there permanently in the 1930s. And the region of Missouri where he's living becomes his primary subject matter. So this image of Hercules and Achelos is actually set on the banks of the Missouri River. We see a steamboat plowing its way up the muddy Missouri in the background. Now, this is a fairly large work, and it was a mural. You can probably tell from the dimensions that it's a wall decoration, a mural for a department store in Kansas City. which would make sense to them to do a Missouri-based theme. And Benton had worked on a number of different public murals by this time. He was quite well known as a muralist. But he had encountered some problems. He had been criticized by many of his patrons because he included things in the murals that they didn't want to see. For example, I got two examples. He was commissioned to do a mural of Indiana history, and he included in that images of the Ku Klux Klan because they were part of Indiana history. And of course, the people who commissioned the work didn't want him to show the bad parts of history. They wanted him to glorify Indiana history, and he simply didn't do that. He was commissioned to do a mural for the Missouri State Capitol building, and he included slave owners in that because it was part of the history of Missouri. And it's not that he liked these ideas. It's not that he sided with Klansmen and slave owners, but he wanted to be honest. He wanted to be true to history, and he felt it would be wrong to gloss over these elements of history if that's what he's supposed to depict, is the history of these regions. And that led to really kind of an all-out ban on any kind of mural projects from Benton. And in fact, ended those commissions. The Smithsonian picture on the right was his first mural project in over 10 years. He'd been sort of blackballed after the Missouri State Capitol Commission. And in order to get this commission for another large-scale mural, he promised that he would only include positive things, that he wouldn't editorialize and insert his own sort of leftist ideas about history and judgment of history into the image. So what he does instead is he turns to Greek mythology as a way of making this an incredibly positive image, drawing some connections between famous Greek myths and modern society in the Midwest. So this is an allegory for the Midwest, for the bounty of the Midwest, the bounty of the harvest. And we'll get into that, right? What is Akalos? Akalos was the Greek god of the rivers, and many Greek gods can shape shift. And Akalos, as the god of the rivers, whenever it was flood season, Akalos turned into a bull, an angry bull, and he would gouge channels through the earth with his horns, in the same way that the raging river would, gouge through the earth. And he's eventually defeated by Hercules, who tears off one of his horns in order to defeat him. And here Hercules appears as a Midwestern farmer. He's taken off his straw hat, he's put down his axe, and he's wearing a pair of jeans with a bandana in his back pocket, and he's gone shirtless. And he's about to now conquer Akalos the bull. And what happens in the myth is that the bull of Akalos becomes the cornucopia, the horn of plenty, filled with nature's bounty. So Hercules conquering Akalos became a metaphor for humans controlling nature. What originally ravaged the Missouri River, right, originally ravaged the earth, now has been tamed, brought to bay, and allowed now to provide the water needed for extraordinary crop harvest. This is all through the use of dams to control the flooding year in and year out. And so this is Benton's regionalism in this particular picture. The myth as a metaphor for the Midwest, the bounty of the harvest that came from the taming of the Missouri River, all told through mythological allegory. So we've seen here is in America after Dada, we've seen some artists really very much influenced by Dada, the Precisionists, and then we've seen some artists who are reacting against that kind of modernism and coming up with regionalism, which is itself a very traditionalist approach to art making in a period that is increasingly dominated by a more abstract sensibility from European modernism.